Hello, my name is Michael Byers. I'm the chair of the Salt Spring Forum, which is a local charity based on Salt Spring Island that brings interesting and influential people to our little island for discussions of the great issues of our day. Because of COVID-19, we've had to change our approach, and instead of having two people on stage and an audience asking questions, we've shifted to a video format where we have a guest who's being filmed directly and a moderator appearing on a laptop so that we can maintain social distancing. And tonight we have a fabulous event with Timothy Brook, Professor Tim Brook from the University of British Columbia, a professor of history, of Chinese history, who has previously held professorships at both the University of Toronto and Oxford University. You'll learn more about him in the next hour. And to moderate Tim Brook, we have Louise Doucet, who is a French immersion and social studies teacher here on Salt Spring Island, and as you will see, a formidable and engaging interviewer. Apart from that, we have questions from Salt Spring and beyond posed in advance that Louise will ask, and these questions have not been seen by Professor Brook until he's actually asked them during the taping. And last but not least, we're going to have this on YouTube, linked to that by both the Salt Spring Forum and our new partner, the Tai. It's a partnership I'm really excited about. I hope it will expand our viewership in these difficult times. We need to expand our minds, to learn about the situation we're in, to dig deeper and go more broadly into the context around COVID-19 and our unique place in history. So without further ado, I give you Professor Timothy Brook and Louise Doucet.
Well, hi Tim, thanks for being with us tonight. During this time of social distancing, we're talking across screens to one another, but I must admit I've been enjoying reading your new book while I've been socially isolated, Great State, China and the World. It's been a great read. But I wonder, while I've been reading it, I asked myself a question about how a non-Asian, such as yourself, would come to have an interest in this area of the world.
Thank you, Louise. It's a big question that I can answer in any number of ways, but I'll keep it simple. But first, if I may, can I address any potential Chinese viewers of this video first?
Of course, go ahead.
好，首先我想给中国观众讲几句话。我不是中国人，很容易看得出来。可是我学习中文，研究中国历史，已经快50年了，所以我对中国有一点了解。我们的立场不一样，我站在外面，我用外面的透视看中国，跟中国人的透视可能稍微不一样，可是也有它的价值。我又不支持中国，也不反对中国，我分析中国。关心中国，所以今天晚上的一些想法和评论都是从那个角度来开发的，请大家了解一下吧。好，谢谢。I have just told my Chinese viewers, if I have any, that I wanted them to understand that I'm not Chinese. It doesn't take much to look at me and see that I'm not Chinese, but I wanted them to understand that rather than a liability can be its own kind of asset. If I had been Chinese growing up in the 1970s, going to university, becoming interested in China, there would have been nothing exceptional about that. But I grew up in Toronto from a background in which there were no connections whatsoever to China. But I became intrigued. This is the early 1970s. It's in the wake of 1968. It's during the resistance to the Vietnam War. Many of us in that generation were concerned to think about the world in new ways. And China offered this kind of double opportunity. On the one hand, China was not part of the capitalist world that we had grown up in. But at the same time, it had its own deep traditions, different philosophies, different ways of looking at the world. And I was intrigued and wanted to know more. And I realized I couldn't understand China if I didn't start studying the language. And one thing led to another, and I ended up in China. I went to China in 1974 for the first time. And as I just said to the Chinese viewers, I've been working on China, studying China now for almost half a century. It's a little shocking, but life goes on and many things happen. But China has remained in the center of my attention. I feel very lucky to have made a choice that I didn't understand at the time that I made it. But certainly since the 1970s, China has moved into everyone's ken.
So how would an outsider, such as yourself, come to understand their culture? How did you manage to do that?
You have to do, at a minimum, two things. One is that you have to learn to speak the language, even if you speak it badly. Only by embracing a foreign language can you begin to sort of see what the corridors of thought are in that culture. Mm-hmm. How do you formulate ideas? How do you communicate ideas? How do you shape ideas? So I started doing that, and I became somewhat enamored of calligraphy. I really enjoyed the visual aspect of Chinese, so that sort of drew me in. The other thing you have to do is start making Chinese friends. You have to get inside the personal space of other people who live in that culture and speak in that culture. And I had the good fortune to do that. I went off to China for a couple of years as a student, and then have been back many times since then. And through that, and then also as a scholar reading historical texts and so forth, you begin to assemble a vision, and it's a vision that can never be the Chinese way of looking at things. But there are 1.4 billion Chinese, and they can look at the world as they choose. I come from a different background, and so that gives me, as I again said to my Chinese viewers, that gives me a different perspective that I think has some value, so that for good or not, if China wants to have a conversation with the outside world, it has to have a conversation with people like me.
Oh, in reading your book, you mentioned in the foreword that one of the reasons you wanted to write this book was to bridge the gap between the Chinese of history and the China of now, and China and the rest of the world. So could you elaborate a little bit on the purpose you had when you wrote the book?
Yes, my first purpose was to try and give readers in the West some kind of depth to China. We see China in the present under the control of the Chinese Communist Party and its particular general secretary at the moment, facing the world in certain ways. So we have a very shallow vision of China. So what I decided to do in the book is go all the way back to the 13th century and then slowly walk the reader forward. Sort of every 70 or 80 years, I would find an incident or a personality or a work of art, and then use those to try and layer up some kind of understanding beneath the China that we see today. And my goal was not to exoticize China in the book. In fact, I want the reader to come away basically thinking, oh, China is just like anywhere else. Chinese are just like anyone else. But through language and culture, we have cultivated differences. We want to understand those differences, but I just wanted to kind of tone down the specialness with which China is viewed, or the exceptionality of China. So that's the second thing, not just bringing China of the past into conversation with China in the present, but to bring China into the world. A point I make over and over again in the book, it gets perhaps a little tedious, is that China has never not been part of the world. It's very much if you like, a Chinese discourse to say, well, China is its own culture, it's special, it's somewhat exceptional, it's been cut off from the rest of the world. But frankly, the West does the same thing too. The West celebrates certain kinds of attributes and histories and characteristics that make some people in the West feel that they are something special as well. Mm-hmm. And what I wanted to do, I wanted to lower that boundary between China and the West. I wanted to show Chinese moving out into the world, people from outside China moving into China, and in fact creating a world at the east end of Asia that isn't particularly, I'm not sure how to phrase this, it isn't particularly Chinese. China has been shaped by the Mongols, by the Japanese, by Europeans, by the interactions that China's had with the world for centuries. So there isn't a self-contained China hiding behind the Great Wall. It's always been part of the world. And if some people want to create a distance between China and the rest of the world, well, that's what I want to try and, I want to reduce that difference. I want us to get to be able to talk to each other and recognize each other as human beings.
Well, your book is very timely, and the interest that it generated amongst foreign members and the audience is evident in the questions that we received tonight. And so I think we should proceed with the questions that people have sent. And the first one reads, China seems to be a major wellspring of zoonotic diseases. Is this true? And if so, is it due to cultural and economic practices? And will the COVID-19 pandemic spell the end of wet markets in China?
This is a large question, and I'm glad that you asked it, because this, of course, is in the forefront of everyone's mind. If it's in any way appropriate to the book that I've written, I devote a chapter to the spread of the plague around the world in the 14th century. And I'm going to talk about the historical lessons before I talk about the coronavirus, if I may. In the 14th century, we all know the history of the Black Death. It's in the 1340s. The Middle East and Europe are overrun by Yersinia pestis, as the bacteria is called. It spreads very quickly to devastating effect because, well, for many reasons, the physicians at the time had no good theory to explain this disease, and they had no good treatments. Not perhaps all that unlike the coronavirus, for which we have certain kinds of intensive care treatments, but we have no way of dealing medically with it. The only way we can deal with the coronavirus is through public health interventions, and that's what they did in the 14th century. Now, at the time, back in 1348, as the Black Death spreads across Europe, what are people saying to each other in Europe? They're saying, it comes from China. Because China is the other end of the world, it's far away, it's unknown, it's foreign. The disease has to have come from China. And this became a sort of truism in the history books. And so the question I ask in the chapter is it true? I don't think it is. We have new techniques for understanding how diseases spread ever since genomic sequencing became a standard toolkit of bioscience, and it's now becoming part of the standard toolkit of historians. So from since 2010, paleogeneticists have been able to reconstruct the DNA of the disease that struck Europe in the 1340s and that traveled around Europe. And one of the interesting things we're discovering is that during that period of disease, there were outbreaks of epidemics in China a decade later. There's no evidence of outbreaks of the disease in China during the 1330s and the 1340s. So it seemed to suggest that the disease actually originates in the center of Eurasia. I suspect Kyrgyzstan is the origin of the Black Death genome, and that it spreads to Europe, and then it spreads to China. And what's even more interesting is that we have another pandemic in 1894, when the Black Death leaves Hong Kong and goes out to the world. This is why ground squirrels in California have the plague. They caught the plague as a result of the pandemic of 1894. But interestingly enough, when you do the genomic sequencing on the plague, it turns out that that version of the plague had to have come to China from Europe. Because it couldn't have originated in China. The way the disease traveled was that it went to Europe first and then it came back and infected China. So the idea that China was somehow causing the plague outbreak of the 1890s, at the time that's what was thought. But in fact, the genomic science is showing that China was not responsible for that plague whatsoever. So science is allowing us to take apart some historical myths. Now, what have we got today? The coronavirus did indeed originate in China, And despite some unfortunate attempts by the Chinese Communist Party spokespersons to suggest that it might have originated abroad, it began in China. These diseases, these viruses live in bat populations. This is their natural habitat. SARS came out in 2002 moved into human hosts, and in 2003 caused the SARS epidemic. And this is what the current coronavirus has done. It's anyone's guess still at this point how it got from the bats to the human population. One of the guesses is a certain kind of anteater that lives in China called a pangolin. The guess is as good as any, but it seems that the epicenter of the outbreak was in a particular meat and seafood market in the city of Wuhan. And that's where the transfer occurred. Now, the coronavirus doesn't particularly want to infect human beings. It does much better in bats. It prefers bats because it doesn't kill them. Unfortunately, it kills us. And a disease that kills us is ill-suited to living with us. And most viruses will sort of dampen down so that they don't kill their host, because you kill off the host and you kill the disease. That, however, is the secret for controlling this disease, public health measures in which we all isolate ourselves, because once the disease has run its course and your body has either developed the antibodies or succumbed to the disease dies. It's got nowhere else to go. The unfortunate part of this story is that the Chinese political authorities, in my view, took too long to act. And in fact, they had almost the complete genome sequence for the coronavirus on December the 29th. But they did not release that information to the World Health Organization until January 10th. There was a 10-day period in there that allowed the coronavirus to escape from the community in which it appeared, get into the hospitals, and then spread out of Wuhan. It's a particularly unfortunate moment. We have, the details of this history, are fascinating. What is particularly concerning is that once the coronavirus had been sequenced, the lab that did it realized this is very close to SARS. And they sent a report back to Wuhan. And in fact, they were so concerned that the people who ran the lab flew to Wuhan. They were in Canton. They flew to Wuhan to talk to hospital authorities. And the head of ER at Wuhan Central Hospital saw the report. And she immediately sent out a text to a couple of friends in the medical community in Wuhan to say, we have a SARS-like virus that is broken out, and you need to be aware of this. And for that, 8 doctors in Wuhan were dragged into the police station and told to sign statements that their claims about the virus were false. All the samples in the Wuhan hospitals were gathered up. They were ordered to destroy their samples. The Communist Party wanted this thing to go away. And meanwhile, the doctors down at the front line through the first week or two of January are just scrambling to figure out how to deal with this new infection. And by January 20th, Wuhan was looking like New York is looking today. The infections were shooting way up. They didn't have enough ventilators. They didn't have enough masks. Healthcare workers were starting to be infected. It's exactly the same scenario that New York is facing. And what China did, fortunately, it took far too long, but by the last week of January, the Chinese government finally organized a response, a public health response, to bring this under control. Now, I've gone rather far away from what the questioner was asked, but the particular seafood market where it's thought the transfer might have occurred was closed down very quickly in early January, and the Chinese government has indicated that it's going to close down these sorts of markets. But we don't yet know whether that's where the transfer took place, because often a virus has to find an intermediate creature to get to humans, because we don't interact with bats very much. So it's got to go into another creature that is then going to be made available to us. Now, Chinese medicine traditionally has the notion that certain animal body parts are beneficial for human health. And these so-called wet markets are places where you can go and buy those exotic animals in order to make use of traditional Chinese therapies. In fact, it's a kind of display of wealth, because these wild creatures that they bring in are very expensive. Only rich people can afford to buy them. It's a way of showing off. And it has disastrous epidemiological consequences. The human species has only domesticated 16 different types of animals in its history. We've learned to live with them. Cows, dogs, we can more or less live with them. But we can't live with pangolins, we can't live with bats, and we can't live with the other kinds of creatures that are being brought into these markets and sold. So we have to learn, and here this is maybe almost a cultural question, Chinese medical culture, traditional medical culture, has to accept that humans need to insulate themselves from these creatures. And unless we do, the virus is just going to keep popping across. And why it does this, we don't have a good theory for why viruses move to humans, but the best way for it not to happen is not to be in contact with these viruses.
Mm-hmm. It's a fascinating subject. Our second question tonight, Tim, comes from Anne Parkinson from Salt Spring Island. And her question is, world travel, past and present, has always been a given. And from your historical perspective, does this mean that global pandemics are also a given? And can we expect more in the future?
The short and sad answer is yes to all of those questions. Human beings are mobile. Some human societies settle down into agricultural habits, but even the societies that become agriculture remain mobile. We only have to go back, if I can go back to the Black Death in the 1340s, that moved really quickly. The first outbreak is when the Mongols are in Crimea in 1346. They're in a Genoese trading port. The Genoese and Venetians get onto ships, they sail off immediately, they send it to Italy, and through a kind of curious historical parallel, Italy becomes the epicenter for the Black Death. And then the Black Death just streams out of Italy in every direction it goes. So while we may fancy ourselves to be very globalized and very mobile in 2020, even in 1348, people were traveling and people were moving and they were taking the diseases with them. This is always going to happen. The trouble with airplanes is that things just move so much more quickly. So in this case of the outbreak of the coronavirus in China, if it had taken ships to get the coronavirus out to the rest of the world, we would not have been infected. It would have just been too difficult for the coronavirus to survive, to get to Switzerland from Wuhan. It just would not have happened. But now that we have airplanes, of course, it is going to happen. So what I think we need to do as a global community, if such a thing is ever going to emerge out of this particular crisis, what we need to do as a global community is to think more consciously about travel. Should we travel less? Is there a way to travel more responsibly? Are we going to need, and I think we are we going to need greater health measures to try and control the possibility that when you get onto the plane, it's not just you on the plane, but it's those millions of viruses in your body. They're getting on the plane with you, and one of them might want to jump to someone else, and in which case another pandemic is going to occur. So I'm afraid if it wasn't this virus that did it, it would have been another. What is particularly shocking this time around to me is that if we go back to some of the earlier outbreaks of viruses in China, we go back to SARS, for example, in 2003. That escaped from China to Canada famously. It was in Vancouver and Toronto. Medical authorities in Vancouver were very quick to control it. It took Toronto a little bit longer, but that has to do with the social networks of the Chinese community in Toronto. But we were able to stop that before it hit 800 deaths. We are now in the thousands, and those numbers are going to keep climbing. So what am I trying to say here? Not that the coronavirus is any worse than SARS. It's considered possibly less lethal than SARS. But in 2003, the active agent there was the World Health Organization. They were kept out of the early stages of the epidemic in China. And when they finally got in, they moved so quickly and so effectively that SARS stopped at less than 800 fatalities. This time around, in my view, the World Health Organization has done much more poorly. The World Health Organization is somewhat exposed to political influence, and the political influences on the World Health Organization limit its capacity to serve the needs of the world as well as it should. And I would hope at the end of all of this, there are several independent inquiries into what happens. I would like that to happen and to look at what the Chinese government did. I would like to have an independent inquiry on what the American government is doing, and I'd like an independent inquiry in the World Health Organization. I think they have failed us. It's not entirely their fault, but the measures that needed to be put in place were not put in place fast enough. Mm-hmm. But that, of course, also has to do with the fact that the world in 2020 is not a place in which it's easy to get the agreement of world leaders and world governments about what needs to be done.
And yet it's so important that we do.
And it is so important that we do this. Globalization makes better coordination at the global level absolutely essential. And at the moment, we don't have the tools to do it. The United Nations is there and doing something. The World Health Organization is there and doing something, but we need much more robust institutions. That, of course, flies in the face of what's going on politically around the world. China is not about to merge itself into a global government. The United States is not about to do it. Russia's not about to do it. None of the great powers is interested in, is putting this on their agenda. So I think it behooves those of us in the middle powers to get our act together and start lobbying the great powers to back off and start operating more effectively on a global basis. But I think there's another lesson here, if I can go one step further, and that is the fact of the pandemic is showing us that perhaps we need to organize our national economies a little bit differently. Mm-hmm. What do business schools in Canada teach their students? To find products at the lowest possible price and set up supply chains that allow us to source all our materials externally and then package them in Canada. Well, if China is the major source of pharmaceutical raw materials and China is caught in an epidemic, what are we in Canada going to do to provide ourselves with the pharmaceuticals we need? So, in fact, I'm arguing against myself, and we have to figure out this balance. We need, to some extent, we need national social economies, but we also need a global institutional framework. And I've been accused of being something of an idealist on these issues, but I think this is the moment for idealism to start speaking to the realpolitik that otherwise is leaving us all exposed to this pandemic.
There were reports of dissatisfaction with the Xi Jinping handling of the early stages, and has that dissatisfaction receded, and would President Xi have felt threatened by it?
The short answer to all of those questions is yes. Intense dissatisfaction, intense anger, particularly in Wuhan, which is where the outbreak is occurring. There are two particular moments that I'd like to point out. One is the death of Dr. Li Wenliang. He is the young ophthalmologist who is one of the ones to whom the head of the ER at Central Hospital passed the news that there was a SARS-like coronavirus in the hospital. He was one of the 8 doctors who then passed it to their professional WeChat groups. They didn't blow the whistle. They just let their colleagues in the hospital know, for which he was reprimanded and told to sign a document stating that the coronavirus did not exist. He died on February the 7th. and the outpouring of anger and frustration of people in Wuhan was enormous. His picture was flashed up everywhere. It was all over the web, and the government censors got in and took that picture down as fast as they possibly could. But people found ways to code this, and so the idea of the whistleblower became popular. So if you wanted to code a somewhat seditious message about how you thought the government was handling the coronavirus, you included a whistle in your byline, and that immediately gave it away. Then a new wave of anger and frustration breaks out in early March. China has a popular magazine called People magazine. They did an interview with the head of the emergency room at Central Hospital. And it's just it's such a sad account that she gives of the intense frustration she had trying to manage this, being reprimanded by her superiors for letting word out that there was a SARS-like virus inside the hospital. In fact, she went home on the first night and told her husband, "I may be disappeared. You're going to have to look after our children." Oh, that's how seriously she was threatened. And yet she was there in the front line day after day, watching her doctors get sick, watching her nurses get sick, and just felt she was just trying to fight off the interference from the Communist Party in her medical work. It's a moving account. As soon as People magazine put it up, of course, it was retracted, taken down, but copies just spread all over the web. And Chinese netizens came up with these great schemes. One of them, for example, translated it into Korean and then sent it out, and you could use Google Translate to get it out of Korean back into Chinese. Another one, there was an old code developed in the 19th century. When the telegraph first comes to China, they need to code every Chinese character. So they have these 4-digit codes for every character. And so somebody transformed the interview into the old telegraph code, but it had to include an explanation of what a telegraph was, because of course Chinese today don't know what telegraph is. Another one brought it out using images from that Bergman film, Seventh Seal, splashed across the front so that it looked like some sort of essay on cinematography. All of these games were played. And again, the whistle comes up, and she said in her interview, "I'm not a whistleblower, but I did give whistles to my friends." And they became whistleblowers. I don't know what's happened to her, and I worry. I mean, I'm sure she's fine, but her career as a doctor in China is over because she spoke about her own experience. But you see, Wuhan had to clean the city up, and Xi Jinping appeared there on March the 10th to do a victory lap. What they did in Wuhan, they had set up 4 field hospitals. They did it remarkably quickly, absolutely essential, brilliantly done. But what they did is they dismantled them all in the week before Xi Jinping showed up so that he can say, "Look, the field hospitals have been closed." Well, what they did is then redistribute the patients to 300 little field stations out around the city so that you couldn't see the people anymore. And if you reported with symptoms, you were simply told to go home and you weren't tested. So I don't trust Chinese numbers from about, I would say, late February on. I don't trust those numbers. I think China has managed to flatten the curve. The number of infections is going down. But the Chinese Communist Party is trying to use this both to reestablish their authority, which was shaken by their handling of the virus, and also then to try and make a bid internationally. And to its credit, China is doing great things. It's sending masks and ventilators to Italy, where they are needed most. Xi Jinping has even offered President Trump material help, which of course he won't be able to accept for political reasons. So the Communist Party is trying to turn this into a photo op on the international stage. Most Chinese people probably don't even know that all of this has gone on. It's the people in Wuhan and Shanghai, the sort of the well-connected people right in the heart of the country, they know what's going on, and they are furious. There's one professor at Tsinghua University in Beijing who wrote just a blistering essay talking about the new totalitarianism and very directly criticizing the Communist Party for its handling of the disease, of being more concerned with politics than it was for people's lives. But that's not the story that ambassadors around the world have all been given their talking points, and they have to talk up how this is a great success and proof that China has done the right thing. But I feel conflicted talking about this in a way because the Chinese government has taken the public health measures that have to be taken. People have to self-isolate. Transportation systems have to be cut. Areas where there's high infection have to be closed off. The transportation has to be shut down. I noticed 2 nights ago the governor of Mississippi said that Mississippi will never be China. Well, that is a mean and ignorant thing to say, because if the state of Mississippi does not adopt reasonable public health measures, there will be thousands of people dead within the next 3 weeks in Mississippi. So it's shameful that China, on the one hand, China has tried to develop effective methods, but on the other hand, to then damn China for being the origin of the coronavirus, well, in some way that's there is no fair here. There's it's a car crash of factors that it's very difficult for me to pull apart.
Yeah, it is, and you've got to wonder when it'll all end. Your response to the last question really is a great segue to this next one, which asks, what effect will this pandemic have on privacy and other human rights in China? I guess maybe in the long term. And do you anticipate freedom of movement will be curtailed in China as a result in a long-lasting way?
Well, I would say that the effects on China are not going to be so much of that sort. Chinese have become used to the idea of being mobile. That has been part of the new economy in China, so people are free to move around. And I think it would be a big mistake for the government to end that. And in fact, the government is doing its best to try and reestablish normal transportation links. So I don't think it's going to have that effect on China. In terms of digital surveillance, that has been going on at a furious rate in China, and that will continue. One of the things that the Chinese government did was to require everybody with a cell phone to download an app that certifies that you are coronavirus free or that you have the antibodies for coronavirus. And so it means 1.4 billion people on their cell phones are being communicated with by the Central Health Authority in China. And at one level, this is, I guess, a sensible thing to do. One of the interesting things, though, that has come out of this is that 21 million cell phones have disappeared. And this has been used by some people to wonder how many people died. Were the deaths, were the fatalities much higher than we think? I don't think so, because China has a total of 1.4 billion people and 1.6 billion cell phones. So I think all we're seeing is that people have multiple cell phones. But I think that digital surveillance is already very intense in China and is going to become more so. But I think the coronavirus is just part of every one of those trends that the Chinese government wants to use to make sure that there will never be one word of opposition to the control of the oligarchy.
Right. George Shippos wonders, do we know what impact COVID-19 is having in Tibet and among the Uyghur people? And is Beijing exerting itself to protect the health of these people in these regions to the same extent as the rest of the country?
Well, if I may say, I'm glad that George has asked a question, because I hired George as the editor in my book, and he did a superb job. So thank you, George.
I know.
In answer to that question, though, the disease has not spread much into the vast part of China that is populated by its multiple minorities. So it's not significant in Xinjiang, which is where the Uyghur population is. I'm not even sure if they've had any outbreaks there. They didn't ever close the schools, so it hasn't penetrated there. Tibet, I don't know, but I think it's minuscule. Nepal, as far as I understand at this point, which is outside China, but across the border from Tibet, Nepal has only had one case. So for some reason, the interior of Asia has been reasonably well insulated from this. Once you get past that part of Asia and once you get into Iran and Iraq, it's been terrible. But perhaps one of the benefits of living in the thinly populated zones of Xinjiang and Tibet is that viruses have a very hard time with a thin population. They've got nowhere to spread to. So if somebody comes in with it, that person may infect 1 or 2 or 3 people, but after that, the virus is going to go nowhere. So the so-called national minorities of China have been relatively unaffected by this disease.
So, but on the other hand, the Chinese government, this is our next question, the Chinese government's draconian measures to contain COVID-19 seem to have spared it from long-term impacts. So Western democracies appear to be suffering to a much greater extent. As a result, China may end up with even greater power. There are conspiracy theorists who posit that COVID-19 was released as an act of biological warfare. Is there any reason to give credence to these theories?
There is no reason whatsoever to give credence to that theory. What country is going to unleash a lethal virus on its own population? That's beyond the imagination of even the most evil strategists in the Chinese Communist Party. It's just not possible. That rumor was started by a right-wing think tank in the United States on the basis of the fact that Wuhan has a level 4 epidemiological research institute, which is the highest level. So Wuhan is a site where epidemiological research with possible weaponization capacities goes on. But that is a coincidence, because from what we've seen of the genomic analysis of this disease, it fits right in with neighboring diseases in bat populations in the region. I suppose it's possible, but I think it's utterly unthinkable. What dismays me when you hear this kind of thing is the venom and ill will that people are able to summon up in order to demonize a fellow victim in this epidemic. China lost over 8,000 people. The economic loss to China has been enormous. And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to be specific about this, for Americans and for American right-wing institutions and American Republican senators to repeat this kind of thing is extremely pernicious, to the point of evil. What we need to do is step back from this ridiculous demonization of other people and think a little more calmly and intelligently on the basis of the scientific knowledge we have to come to terms with this. So no, this was not cooked up in a lab in Wuhan and released on the world. If China bears some fault for the world pandemic, it's that there were political influences that slowed the response by 10 days. And we all now know that 10 days in the life of this virus, when it starts taking off, is just an enormously long period of time to lose control. So the Chinese government lost control of this virus significantly in that first 10 days of January. It was catastrophic. If they'd been able to move in on the 2nd of January instead of the 11th of January, we would have had a very different global story. That said, we're none of us angels with hindsight. And who could have predicted how big an effect that would have happened? I think, in fact, China, to some extent, has done the best that it possibly could under the circumstances. It has mobilized They brought in some 40,000 healthcare workers from other parts of the country to help Wuhan. Wuhan doctors and nurses were falling sick. The last number we got was back in February, so thousands of doctors and nurses fell ill in the early stage because nobody knew what they were dealing with. So the Chinese government was able to mobilize the human resources, the technical resources, the medical resources to get the Wuhan outbreak under control and then to contain it so that it spread less than it otherwise might have. And there isn't a Western government that can say we did a better job. The United States has made a huge mess of this, and we are just sitting at the beginning of a period of some terrible consequences for the United States. It chills me. Canada has done reasonably well. The United Kingdom was too late in responding. Italy is not to be faulted, I think. It took Italy by surprise at such an early stage that Italy has done what it's tried to do, but the virulence of this disease is such that you can't wait around and think, oh, it's not going to affect me. Once you have the evidence, and really the WHO did put the world on notice back, well, even before February 24th. They was putting the world on notice before that. But by February the 24th, when its China report came out, it was very specific what has to be done to stop the virus, and almost no government responded with the appropriate measures. I don't think this is a problem of democracy, so I don't want to play this as totalitarianism solves the world's problems and democracy makes its mess. I think the problem is the larger political culture that has been created by an out-of-control right wing that is rampant across Europe and North America. That this failure to take responsibility, this failure to accept the need for appropriate government regulation when it is required, that's the failure. We've brought that on ourselves. That's not democracy's fault. That's our failure to educate ourselves, our failure to understand what needs to be done, our failure to support education at all levels. The United States and Canada have been stripping out support for education at all levels. Of course, you make the population less informed, you make them less capable of understanding what has to be done in urgent situations. At this point, everybody in North America should move into self-isolation. The entire North American population should be doing this. Africa should also be doing this. I think we're on the beginning of a terrible pandemic in Africa. Africa having less of the kind of medical infrastructure that North America does. But at this point, you and I have to talk this way. You have to be down at the south end of the island. I have to be up here in the middle of the island. We can't do this in the same room, and it's the only responsible thing that we all can do. So this issue has become urgent, and to sit around and blame China, I think, is morally inexcusable.
You're very passionate about this.
Well, that's the problem with working on something for 48 years. You get you develop a kind of. I'm not saying that. One of the things I said to my Chinese viewers at the very beginning is that I neither support nor oppose China. I see my role as to be concerned about China and to analyze China, and I've been doing that for 48 years. And I'm not sure that it's had any effect whatsoever, but one hopes.
So on the same subject again, another segue here. Wayne McIntyre of Salt Spring Island wants to know about this. 5 years ago, Michael Pillsbury published the 100-Year Marathon, China's Secret Strategy to Replace America as a Global Superpower. And the book received a great deal of attention in the United States. So Wayne would like to know what you think of this book.
Well, I'm sorry, Wayne, but this is the sort of book I just cannot waste my time on because it's politically motivated. There is no secret plot to take over the world. It's out in plain sight. China has made very clear that it will invest in every economy around the world where it is welcome. In doing so, it will create debt relationships to the poorer countries of the world that will allow it to dominate the politics of the local country and to enable it to control the General Assembly of the United Nations. Now, China is not stating this openly, but it's obvious what's going on. And this is not a nefarious plot. The fact is that many parts of Asia, Africa, and South America are undercapitalized, have woefully inadequate infrastructure, and China is saying, let us build your infrastructure and then let us have contracts to take advantage of that. It's simply good business sense. I'm uneasy about this. I'm uneasy about the effect that this is having. It's creating a debt spiral, not unlike the debt spiral we saw in the Third World when the American economy was trying to gobble everything up. But the fact of the matter is the United States has been rudderless for 20 years. The United States doesn't know what it's doing. It's got no global strategy, either economically or politically. And so, of course, the United States has created a vacuum, and China is happily stepping into that. And the United States has lost the moral high ground. I mean, I would prefer that we develop a world order in which access to information and access to reasonable debate are key to the health of our societies. China does not allow that, and to that extent, I am not happy to see the extent to which China is investing and, frankly, infiltrating politically all over the world. I'm very unhappy with that. But this is not to me, is not a time for the United States to say, well, the Chinese are up to some devilish Chinese plan. It's simply a reflection of the fact that there is a complete lack of leadership, a complete lack of vision within the American government. Until that is corrected, China will simply do what it's continuing to do and will capture global supply chains. So I'm sorry I've perhaps gone on a little bit too long on that, but I understand the anxieties, and I think rather than blaming China, we need to think a little bit more carefully about what we've chosen as the policies that are going to guide our governments. Once we sort ourselves out a little more clearly, then I think we're in a stronger position. If we wish to posit ourselves as a positive alternative to China, we can do it then. But we're not in a position to do that at the moment, to my disappointment.
So, adding to this Chinese takeover of the world, how do you think the Chinese government regards Donald Trump's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States? And would they see it as working to their advantage? Or would they be wanting to see a more effective approach to dealing with a global threat?
I think they're seeing it in very different ways. Yes, the spread of COVID-19 to the world will work to their advantage. It's not something that they caused, but they understand that it will work to their advantage, and they're going to take advantage of it. I think they're probably dismayed at the failure of the American government to be more effective, because the spread of the virus in the United States is a further threat to China in many ways. It will freeze the American economy for a period of time. The effects on the Chinese economy are going to be horrendous if the American economy collapses. But also, the thing about this virus, unlike the plague, which maybe mutates once a year, the coronavirus can mutate in a week or less. And every time the virus mutates, its epidemiological characteristics change. So as the virus mutates its way across the United States, it may then end up reinfecting China. So it's in everyone's interest to stop this. And I have no idea what's in the heads of the Chinese leaders. Frankly, I have no idea what's in the heads of the Republican leaders in the United States either. They're both playing politics, and the victims are going to be ordinary people, and I find that appalling.
Mm-hmm. It really is. On a totally different topic, but related again, the levels of air pollution and carbon dioxide emissions have dropped drastically as a result of COVID-19's crisis. Earlier today, hundreds of Canadian academics issued an open letter to the Canadian government calling on it to seize the moment by regrowing the Canadian economy based on sustainable energy sources. Is it possible that the Chinese government will take this approach as well?
I think it's a good idea. I think the Chinese government is already intensely aware of the problem of atmospheric pollution in China. And yes, the number of people, had there been no COVID-19, more people would have died in China of the effects of air pollution than have died of COVID-19. It's a curious situation that we find ourselves in, that the disease is creating an opportunity for more people to survive. Very counterintuitive, but this seems to be what's going on. The pandemic is an opportunity for a number of things: to rethink our energy use and energy policies, to rethink our climate responsibilities. One thing I should say is that climate change is one of the things that can affect the way in which viruses and bacteria mutate, and whether the increase in pandemics since the 1990s is due to climate change. I'm not a scientist, I can't answer that question, but this is an opportunity to think about, in a large sense, about the environment. There's also at least two groups of people who are arguing that a guaranteed national income should be an appropriate policy response to COVID-19. Instead of squeezing people dry and expecting them to survive when they're going to have several months of no income, why not bring in a guaranteed national income, which has been shown, at least in theory, to have a positive effect in the economy. It's a great moment for the United States to start realizing that it needs socialized medicine. That's not going to happen, but at least we have that in Canada. So this is an opportunity while Boris Johnson and Justin Trudeau are self-isolating at home, to perhaps think about the larger policies that the global economy has been pushing them to adopt, and just step back a minute and think, do we need to be doing something different? My hopes are very low in this regard, but I like the brilliance of the suggestion.
Earlier on, you said you were an eternal optimist. Hopefully there will be some changes that come forth from this pandemic. We're on our last question here, Tim.
Yes.
So what effect might COVID-19 have on Canada-China relations? The recent dispute resulting from the arrest of Huawei executive Meng seems rather trivial compared to a global pandemic. And do you expect that the two countries to put aside their differences now?
It would be nice if the two countries did put aside their differences, but this is a very tough question. Many of my colleagues who specialize in China have wanted to find an easy solution to the Meng Wanzhou problem, the Huawei problem, and just figure out a way for her to return to China and then everything normalizes. But I have felt personally so offended by China's seizure of two Canadians in response, literally a government hostage-taking act, that I don't know how we are going to step back from that. I don't know how China's put itself in a very difficult position, taking foreign hostages over what is largely a political and economic dispute, I think is hugely unsatisfactory. And I think if China would like to have a better relationship with Canada, it's up to China to return the two Canadian hostages, and then we can work something out. And so I, for one, will not go to China until those hostages are returned. And I will not work formally with Chinese colleagues on any projects until the Canadian hostages are returned. And on this, I would like to be optimistic, but it's difficult.
Whoa. What a fascinating conversation this evening. I thank you so much on behalf of myself and everybody who's going to be viewing this for being so open to answering these questions and your obvious passion and your knowledge about this subject. It's really enlightened my understanding of China and the COVID-19. Thank you very much.
Well, Louise, thank you for taking your evening to be the moderator in tonight's event. I'm not generally a public speaker, but you've asked questions that I care about, and I appreciate having the opportunity to share my thoughts with you.